Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to another episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe, episode 10 of the Historian's Lounge. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Many of you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining me today is a returning guest making their second appearance back on the show. Now, for those who remember this guest, he is a graduate of the Department of History at the University of Malta, where he had from his undergraduate degree, BA in European and Global History with Archaeology between 2020 and 2023. While reading for his degree, he also worked as a researcher with AIS Archaeology, conducting archaeological and historical research for the head archaeologist, Mr. Vincenzo Cherubini. I probably butchered that, and I apologize. On sites like the Royal Navy Hospital in Mtarfa, Malta, and he is also active with the Malta University Historical Society and is their events coordinator. Currently reading for his Master's of Arts in European and Global History at the University of Malta, where he continues to work on medieval and crusading history under the supervision of Mr. Charles Dalli. And more recently, last December, his paper was accepted to be a part of an amazing opportunity, which will be published in a huge publication in Europe, which is an amazing accomplishment. So happy for him. And in today's episode, viewers and listeners, we're going to be talking about a lesser known battle in the global history to those outside of Malta. But for those who know about this particular battle, it had huge global ramifications for not just the Mediterranean world, but possibly the Western world itself. And that is, of course, the Battle of Malta between the Knights of the Hospital and the forces of Suleiman the Magnificent. And to tell us all about that and more, I am so happy to introduce my good friend and fellow historian coming back on the show, Mr. Luke Gauci. Luke, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for the invite, Gabriel. It's an honor. You might have exploded the research paper a bit, but yes, basically it's going to be published with Heritage Malta's journal Tessere in the coming weeks. I just submitted the last application of the last version to the publishing department. But yeah, yes, it was a big thing. I ended up in Strasbourg in front of the Council of Europe. So
Nice.
yeah.
That's awesome. And before we begin, Luke, is there any updates you would like to give to the viewers since the last time you were on the show a year ago?
So since the last time we were here, I have left the Malta University Historical Society. I was a part of it for 4 years. I was their assistant secretary in first year. In second year, I was their I was their campus liaison officer. Third year, I was the public relations officer, and then in the first year of my master's, I was their events coordinator. But I took the decision to make way for new blood. So aside from the fact that since my master's is by research, I am very rarely at university anymore. Aside from the fact that I work full time now, so there's that as well. Yeah, since actually I used to during the first interview that we had, I was still stationed at Fort Saint Angelo, in Birgu, which will come up in our discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Then I was moved to the Maritime Museum for a while, for about 3 months. There was the exhibition in between the restoration projects. It should take about 2 or 3 years for the museum to be completely restored. And in the meantime, there was a temporary exhibition, Islands at the Crossroads, which was created by Liam Gauci, Ivan Crocker, and Gianluca whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. Balson.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay, I remembered. But then at the end of May, the museum closed to continue the restoration work. and I was moved to the House of Hypogym, which is where I currently am. I'm their on-site coordinator. Basically, I make sure that the site is run on a day-to-day basis, coordinating with the curatorial staff to make sure that the microenvironment is maintained, and conducting tours when needed. Anyway, hopefully, eventually, I'll manage to get into the actual curatorial department. Eventually, now we'll see. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, all the best to you, Luke. All the best to you. I know you're very passionate about history and archaeology. I have no doubt you will get exactly what you want. And again, so happy to have you back on the show and talk about this particular piece of not just world history, but also military history and crusading history. Because, viewers, this battle is very, very significant. And the lead up to that is very, very interesting. So, Luke, let's set the stage as like a brief overview of the Battle of Malta and to give people an idea of what to expect.
So, as we know, 1291, Acre fell to the Islamic forces in the east. The Crusader states were destroyed, and the military orders had to leave. Famously, the Templars ended up roaming Europe until they were destroyed by Philip Augustus in the early 1310s, if I'm not mistaken. And the Order of Saint John, or the Knights Hospitaller, ended up first on Cyprus and then eventually on the island of Rhodes in 1311, if I'm not mistaken. Which is, for those who are not aware, if you imagine a map of modern day Greece and Turkey, the Greek mainland and Anatolia, the island is a small island just off the coast of modern day Turkey, which was at the time the heart of the Ottoman Empire. By that point, in relation to my master's research as well, the Latin states in the Aegean were still sort of lingering. The Ottomans, the Nicaeans, had retaken Constantinople in 1261. But by the early 14th century, most of Anatolia was underneath the early Ottoman, what would eventually become the Ottoman Empire. Now, you can describe the relation between the Knights Hospitaller and the Ottoman Empire as one of a massive superpower being annoyed by a pesky little fly. It's a military order. Their resources were somewhat limited, but they did have vast resources. It was part of the reason why they were so successful in the Crusader states before 1291. Essentially, the military orders were running the Crusader states by that point. Anyway, and they essentially continued living on Rhodes, sending out corsairs, raiding Ottoman shipping, and this went on until 1522, when Suleiman the Magnificent, who we'll mention a bit more later, finally had enough with the Knights Hospitaller, with the Order of Saint John, and invaded Rhodes. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the siege of Rhodes. Essentially, the Knights lost. They were cast out of Rhodes. They weren't destroyed. A lot of people assume, like when you think about the sack of Constantinople in 1204 or 1453, or the sack of Granada in 1492, that they would be leveled and destroyed and so on. But the Knights, with what they could take, left Rhodes, were allowed to leave Rhodes, and essentially roamed the Mediterranean and the courts of Europe, trying to find a new home. Eventually, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, offered the Knights both Malta and Gozo and Tripoli in modern-day Libya. They were reluctant, to put it mildly, to accept this offer. They were actually more happier to accept Tripoli than they were to accept Malta and gold. So they sent an advance party to Malta in 1524, and essentially it was described as a barren rock. The Castrum Maris, which is what would eventually become Fort St. Angelo, was described as a ruin, and it was a ruin. It was built, supposedly it was built by the Arabs in the Almoravids in the 870s. That is a whole other book that we can go into another time. But eventually, by the 12th century, there are mentions of a structure known as Castrum Maris, which is Latin for castle by the sea, literally, and it was maintained first by the Angevins and then by the Aragonese before the Order of St. John came to Malta. But by 1524, it was a out-of-date ruin. Reluctantly, the Grand Master Saddam accepted the offer, didn't really have much of a choice. And by 1530, the knights arrived in Malta. They took control of the islands, they took control of Tripoli as well, and set about making the island their new home. Now, there is here it's fairly well known, there was a clash between the ruling nobility, in inverted commas, and they weren't very seen on the level as the nobility of Europe, but they were the nobles of Malta, who were operating out of Mdina, which is the old capital city. They were running what was called as the Universitas, and there was a clash between the Order of St. John and the Universitas. They felt that the order did not serve the interests of the island, not the peasants living on the island or the serfs living on the island, but their interests. Anyway, and the order decided, okay, we can't set up our base of operations in Mdina, so we'll set them up in Birgu, which is where Fort St. Angelo is. Now, as I mentioned, when they were on Rhodes, the Order of St. John was mainly a corsairing. That was what, after the loss of the Holy Land, they became known for. They were very good corsairs. And in the long run, it made sense to set up their capital in Birgu, because it was slap bang near the Grand Harbour, in the middle of the Grand Harbour. The Castrum Maris was a fortification that they could evolve, that they could use, and so they set up their government in Birgu. Now, something that a lot of people aren't aware of is that, so between 1530 and 1565, when the Great Siege occurred, the knights had the intention to return to Rhodes. That was always their intention. They didn't want to remain on Malta, but their intention was to recapture Rhodes. But seeing as they were here, they felt that they needed to protect themselves, even if their stay would have only been temporary. So they upgraded the Castrum Maris into what would eventually become Fort St. Angelo. They essentially started to remove some of the round towers. They upgraded the Barbican. They installed what is now today known as the Degoral Battery, which is at the bottom half of. Actually, I can show you. So this is, where's the camera? So this is Fort St. Angelo today. I don't know how much you can see it. Hold on. Okay, so this is how Fort St. Angelo looks today. Okay, so in the front, you have what is known as the Degoral Battery. Okay, and basically what would have been present in the 16th century is the upper Castrum Maris and the bastions along the old part of the fort. So the Gutenberg bastion, which is this one, wouldn't have been built until the 16th century. Sorry, until the 17th century. Okay. Now, basically, St. Angelo remained a medieval castle. The bastions were updated to a certain extent, as I said, but obviously, you can't imagine, if you visit Malta today, you can't imagine Fort St. Angelo at the time of the Great Siege as you're seeing it today. What you're seeing today is a 17th and 18th century reconstruction of the entire fort. Anyway, Birgu was transformed. There is a very, very good study by one of my colleagues who works at the Inquisitor's Palace, Mrs. Rachel Grillo. It was her master's dissertation on the development of Birgu, Bormland, Risla in this period. Essentially, they transformed the island into a floating fortress to a certain extent. Obviously, the majority of the bastions that you see today are, as I said, a 17th and 18th century constructions. But as I said, they were with the intention of returning to Rhodes. So they felt that the basic thing that they could construct was upgrade the fortifications of the Castrum Mares and end it there. Now, by this point, the Ottoman Empire had spread throughout even the Maghreb and North Africa. There were the Berber states were essentially vassals to the Ottoman Empire, and they operated out of the Berber states as corsairs. Malta had, in the medieval period and even in this period, been subject to these raids like any other Mediterranean island. Essentially, when the Ottomans were capturing the Maghreb, the Order of St. John lost Tripoli. In fact, the Grand Master who would eventually become the famous Grand Master who led the knights during the Great Siege, John de la Valette, or de Valette, or however you want to say it, that's another thing. No one is 100% sure if it's La Valette or de Valette. We know that I grew up calling him Jean de la Valette. But I mean, he either works. So at the end of the day, he signed both versions of his name. So anyway, he was taken as a galley slave, and he was a galley slave, if I'm not mistaken, for about 2 years, until eventually he was traded. Essentially, he was freed for some Turkish prisoners that the Order of St. John had on the island. Jump forward roughly 20 years, and we come to 1551. Now, some might have heard of Dragut. He was a famous Barbary corsair, and essentially he landed a force on the island. Now, they tried to march onto Birgu, but they discovered that the fortifications or around that the knights had built in that area were too formidable. They then chose to they anchored their fleet, actually, before I move on. They anchored their fleet in Marsamxett, which is the harbor on the other side of what today is Valletta, because there was no decent fortification at the tip of the peninsula where eventually Valletta would be built. There was a tower and a small gun battery, but essentially they freely sailed into Marsamxett harbor. That is eventually the reason why Fort St. Elmo would eventually be built, to try to stop the enemy armadas just sailing into Marsamxett harbor. Anyway, they found that the fortifications around Birgu were too formidable, so they marched onto Mdina. Now, the fortifications of Mdina at this point were still in their medieval form. The knights had done some renovations, but nothing major. So if you visit Mdina today, again, like with Birgu, the fortifications you see are 17th and 18th century reconstructions. Anyway, and there is a legend. I'm not 100% sure how true it is, but I'll mention it anyway. That the small garrison that there was defending Medina dressed the women and the children up in armor to make it look as though there was a bigger garrison than there actually was. It's a popular legend. I haven't really looked into to see if it's true or not, to be perfectly honest, but it's plausible. Anyway, apparently that the Ottoman forces were fooled. They retreated to their fleet and decided to sail to Gozo. Now, when I mentioned that the Castrum Mares was a ruin, the citadel in Gozo was similar to what you would look at, how you would describe Hajar today.
Mm.
Okay, which is one of the megalithic temples. Basically, it was crumbling. There was a small garrison of knights to defend Gozo, but essentially they couldn't defend the island. The Ottomans apparently took the majority of the population into slavery. They ransacked the fortifications of the Cittadella and carried off the majority of the population of Gozo into slavery. Now, at this point, the Order of St. John decided, look, we're here, we're stuck here for the time being, we're no closer to getting Rhodes back. We cannot let something like this happen again. So they started to upgrade the fortifications of the Cittadella, Gozo. Again, nothing major, but enough that they could be defended. And they started the construction of Fort St. Elmo. Now, if you imagine Valletta today, basically you have the two harbors, and the peninsula dividing them is where Valletta is. At the tip of that peninsula, they built St. Elmo. It was a star fort. If you look at it on Google Maps, you can actually still see the original fort around the later additions. But it was one of the most modern forts for its time. And the fact, in my opinion, that they invested into building this fort to defend the mouth of both harbors is an indication that they were starting to lean on the idea that they were going to remain in Malta. By 1565, St. Elmo was built and finished. Okay? And in 1565 as well, the Grand Master was Grand Master Jean de la Valette. He was elected as Grand Master, and rumors started to reach the island that Suleiman the Magnificent was planning to wipe the Order of St. John off the map forever to finish the job that they didn't do in Rhodes and to capture the island. Now, there are different estimates. So traditionally, the estimates of the fleet and the Janissary army that arrived on the island sat somewhere between 80 and 90,000. Today, that is an exaggeration. We know it's an exaggeration, and we think it is closer to 40 or 50,000. Right? So this was a significant army that was being sent to Malta, to take Malta. Now, a lot of people like to assume, maybe not today, but in the past, Malta is this little rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. No one cares that it's here. That's why the Greeks never colonized us, which is not true, because there is archaeological evidence that the Greeks had a very big presence on the island, even if they didn't colonize the island. But anyway, and it has been put forward that Malta is the gateway to Europe. Now, it's difficult to say. I'm not going to dismiss the importance of the strategic importance of the islands to advancement into Europe, but it is somewhat exaggerated to a certain extent. not to say that it's not true. Oh, the fact that if the Ottoman Empire had managed to capture the islands, they would have had a perfect staging ground to invade Sicily. But that does not mean that in order to invade Sicily, they had to take Malta. There are other islands around Malta, Lampedusa, Pantelleria, so on, and Sicily itself. So it's not necessarily that they would have had to take Malta in order to invade Sicily. Armies have invaded Sicily before without even batting an eye at Malta. So this idea that Malta was the key to a further invasion of Europe is somewhat exaggerated. But when you look at the sources and when you, excuse me one second, when you look at these sources and you consider the evidence, it seems more that Suleiman was intent on wiping out the order rather than making it a staging ground to invade the rest of Europe. That doesn't mean that there wasn't the intention to eventually invade the rest of Europe, but it seems to be more leaning towards the eradication of the Order of St. John. I said their economy was based on corsairing. They were hampering Ottoman shipping in the eastern and in the central Mediterranean. So they had to wipe out the island, the order and the islands once and for all. So the fleet sailed from Constantinople. They took about, if I'm not mistaken, 3 or 4 months to get to the islands. They say that the first spotting of the Ottoman fleet coming from the east was seen from Ferramolino's Cavalier on St. Angelo. Obviously, if you go climb up those stairs, I do not recommend it. Onto the top of Ferramolino's Cavalier today, you cannot see the southern part of the island. It's such a built-up area today that you can't see anything. But in 1565, you would have been able to see Marzashloch. And supposedly the Ottomans first attempted to sail around the island. They tried to get into Marsamshet, but couldn't because there was Saint Elmo defending the front of the port. And they continued sailing around the island, eventually landing. I'm not 100% sure where they landed, but if I'm not mistaken, it's Adira Bay, because that's the biggest bay in the north. But don't quote me on that, I'm not 100% sure. But essentially, they landed somewhere in the north of the island and marched on Mdina. They found that Mdina was quite well garrisoned this time, no need to dress up the women and the children. And essentially, then they decided, look, the only way to take the island is to take St. Elmo and St. Angelo. So they sailed again around the island, landed the fleet in Marsashloch Bay. In fact, I've always found it strange that no major fortification has ever been built around Marsashloch Bay. The only major fortifications there was a battery somewhere near Borcenadur today, which is in the inner part of the harbour, and eventually in the 19th century the British built Fort del Lemara. But the Knights never really built any major fortifications down there, which I always found a bit strange. There is San Lucian's Tower, but it's not I wouldn't compare San Lucian's Tower to St. Elmo or St. Angelo. Anyway, and they set up their camp in Marsa, which is the bottom half of the Grand Harbour. They set up cannons on Mount Sheberras, which is where today Valletta and Floriana stand. And they put cannons roughly where between the Santa Margherita lines and the Cottonera lines, which is today, if you look at a map, if you look at Google Maps, if you look at the three cities, so Birgo, Borma, and Lisla, you can make out where the Cotonera lines are. Now, the Cotonera lines and the Santa Margarita lines were built specifically to avoid this happening again. It was essentially an outer fortification, just in case a cannon line was set up, how the Ottomans set it up in 1565. And essentially, they started bombarding Birgo's landside and Saint Elmo and Saint Angelo from the other end. Essentially, they boxed the Order of Saint John and the Maltese militia fighting with them into the three cities and Saint Elmo. Now, it shows the overconfidence of the overconfidence of the Ottomans. Oh, Dragut and Pasha. Anyway, there were three military leaders, but there was Dragut, there was Pasha, and there was someone else whose name I can't remember. And they thought, rather than their overconfidence, they thought that they could take Saint Elmo in the span of a week. They were so confident, in fact, that Dragut then eventually set up another cannon line on what today is Tinia Point. In fact, some people still call it Dragut Point, where in the 18th century, the Order of St. John would build Fort Tinia there, and continued to bombard St. Elmo. Now, as I said, they thought they would take it in a week. In reality, it took a month. And there is the possibility, there's the idea that they lost nearly a quarter of their army trying to take St. Elmo. By the time they took St. Elmo, it was a ruin. There is a famous legend of a man called Tony Bayada who used to swim across the Grand Harbour between St. Elmo and St. Angelo, sending with messages between the garrison at St. Elmo and La Vallette, who was in St. Angelo. And basically, by the day that St. Elmo fell, they sent a message to Grandmaster La Vallette, saying, "Look, this fort is going to fall. We understand that we need to die to defend this fort, but can we abandon it? There's no point in defending a ruin." And famously, La Vallette told them, "No, fight to the death." So they were a military order. When their grandmaster tells you fight to the death, you fight to the death against the Muslim infidel. And they literally fought to the death. The Ottomans took St. Elmo. In fact, ironically, on the day that they took St. Elmo, supposedly a cannon backfired on Tinia Point and killed Dragut. Now, there are conflicting sources on what exactly happened. They say that he was accidentally shot by one of his own janissaries. He was hit by a rogue cannonball from St. Elmo, or that the cannon backfired and he happened to be standing there when it backfired. The most likely explanation is that the cannon backfired. And he died the day that they took St. Elmo. Now, in traditional crusading style, the knights and the few Maltese that survived the siege of St. Elmo were killed, beheaded, nailed to wooden crosses and floated across the Grand Harbour as a message to the Grand Master who was watching as the fort fell. Apparently, in response, the Grand Master La Vallette was so furious that he beheaded the Ottoman prisoners that he had and shot their heads back at St. Elmo. So I'm pretty sure that if you had to drain the Grand Harbour, you'd probably find a couple of Ottoman skulls down there.
Most likely, yeah.
Along with a couple of BF-109s, but that's another siege. Anyway, and with St. Elmo taken, I mean, what they gained when they took St. Elmo is that they could bring the fleet into Marsamxett. As I said, St. Elmo was a ruin by that point. In reality, that was the only benefit of taking St. Elmo. Anyway, and they started to bombard the Virgo and St. Angelo and Lisla. Now, there is a very good model. If you just give me a second, I can find it for you. The catalogue of the maritime of the islands at the crossroads, the exhibition that I mentioned in the beginning, that was at the Maritime Museum. And in the Maritime Museum, this is all digitized, by the way. If you go to the Maritime Museum website, it's all digitized, it's all there, and you can actually see it on this, what was on display. But one of the things that was on display, if I can find it. Yeah, yes. So this is a model of Sanglia of Lisla during the Great Siege. And if you notice, there are these like rowboats, landing craft of the Ottoman Turks. Essentially, the idea was to show that despite them having gunpowder, there was still hand-on-hand combat. Gunpowder was extremely not very useful to a certain extent in 1565. They used it, but essentially there was still hand-on-hand combat. Anyway, apparently they dragged these landing craft over the Mount Cheberras, over the Olia of Cheberras, into the Grand Harbor, and began literally a D-Day style attack on Lisland and on St. Angelo. Now, the Great Siege. Well, if one of my professors heard me say the Great Siege, he'd probably kill me, but because he believes that it wasn't a Great Siege, which I'll get to eventually. But what is known as the Siege of 1565 lasted approximately 3 months. Now, they should have received support from Sicily, from the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, but it only arrived after 3 months, at which point they were at breaking point. By the time that the reinforcements from the Kingdom of Two Sicilies arrived, there is the legend that La Valette grabbed his steel cap and sword, which is on display at the St. Lawrence Church in Virgo, the original. I've held the replica, which I'm quite proud of. And was ready to fight with his knights at the gates of St. Angelo against the Ottomans. When the reinforcements arrived, the Ottomans retreated, and they were apparently going to try and re-attack the island, relaunch what was left of the army, and attack Virgo again, but the cavalry of the Kingdom of Two Sicilies overwhelmed them, and they retreated. And that was the Great Siege of 1565. It was seen as a major victory. Some historians today like to portray it as it wasn't as big a deal as it's made out to be. I don't necessarily agree with that. It was a significant milestone. It has been blown a bit out of proportion, that much I will agree with, but it was a significant event. And I am basing this claim on the fact that when they were building Valletta a year later, which was named after Grandmaster La Valette, unfortunately he died in 1568, and he didn't see the city finished. It was finished in 1570. Well, the fortifications and the cathedral was finished in 1570, but anyway, and a couple of the auberges. the fact that money started flowing in to build this new capital city. It was built on the Oli of Shiberas, on the peninsula where Saint Elmo was. Again, the idea specifically so that if the Ottomans ever came back, they couldn't set up cannon lines on the land opposite Saint Angelo. And with that, history is history. The Ottomans never came back. There were a couple of times in the 1630s, if I'm not mistaken, and the 1670s when there was a fear that the Ottomans would come back, but they never did. There was a particular episode, again, the subject of a very good book by Professor William Zammit, Slavery, Treason and Blood, in which there was a rebellion on a corsair ship somewhere near Crete, and they overthrew the Ottoman corsairs. He was the captain was one of the Pasha of Rhodes, ironically. They brought the ship to Malta. Eventually, a slave revolt erupted by the meddling of the Pasha of Rhodes, because he was freed because they didn't want to annoy, further retaliate the Ottomans, and he was sort of like a honored guest prisoner, so to speak. And essentially, the Sultan wanted the ship back, and there was the threat that they would invade. Obviously, they never did, but as I said, there were a couple of times here and there when there was a risk that the Ottomans would invade, but they never did.
Fascinating. There's a lot of history to unpack, but it's also, why I love, again, doing this show, because I learned so much about aspects of history that don't really get a lot of recognition, and also debating and debunking some of the myths that have been purported about famous events in history. So I guess let's start with, let's say the main characters of this story, which of course the Ottomans and the Knight of the Hospital. Now, my limited history of the Knights comes from two great medievalists who are very close friends of mine, Dr. Thomas Smith and Dr. Steve Tibble. Both are incredible UK medievalists. I've had them on the show twice, and then together in one episode detailing the history of the Crusades. And if you look at, as you mentioned, Luke, that the Knights of the Hospital were, in addition to another military order during the crusading period. Of course, everyone thinks of the Templars. The Templars are the older brothers of the military monastic orders. But you also had the two other contenders. Yes, you did have the Order of St. Lazarus, the original Plague Knights, but you also had the Knights of the Hospital and the Teutonic Knights, which were very close and very close third. And of course, as you mentioned, Luke, the Templars would be hunted to extinction by the French monarchy, thus leaving, of course, the Knights Hospital and the Teutonics as the last two military orders. Yes, we know from history the Teutonics go up north and start the Northern Crusade after they carve out their own territory. And the Knights Hospital, they reside originally on the island of Crete before getting kicked out of that island, going to Rhodes, and then from Rhodes, landing on their third and final destination, which is the island of Malta.
No, hold on. It wasn't their final destination.
Oh, my mistake.
The Order of St. John technically still exists. It's technically it's its own country. It's what's referred to as a stateless country. Their only territory is a palace in Rome, and the upper section of Fort St. Angelo. It was leased to the Order of St. John in 1998, if I'm not mistaken, for 99 years. In fact, Unfortunately, he recently passed. That was I used to speak to him quite often, Frajan, and he was French Lebanese. He was the resident knight at Saint Angelo. He was sort of like he was essentially an ambassador, so to speak. But yeah, they issued their own passports, their own coinage, everything. So technically, the Order of St. John still exists.
Yes, that's right. Thank you for the correction, Luke. Thank you. And it is very fascinating to see how their history pretty much, has survived. Because for those who don't know, like the Knights of the Hospital, they are, as their name states, they are a hospital for the sick and the wounded. They were the caretakers during the height of the crusading period, and eventually, of course, did become a military monastic order. But as we know, and as Luke mentioned early in this discussion, after the fall of Acre in 1291, the last of the Crusader states, pretty much it was like, okay, we can't do this anymore. We have to fall back. And this is where we begin to see, the shift, where the mind of the Crusades, you still had Crusades around this time, but they weren't as popular or driven as the first three. And it's very interesting to talk about, the later half of this period because it doesn't get a lot of scholarship, at least in my opinion, that I have seen. When we think about crusading history, it's always about the big three: the First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade, maybe at most the Fourth or Fifth Crusade, but not a lot.
Master's topic after all.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. And then, of course, we'll talk about the other main characters, which are the Ottomans, which their history is very, very fascinating. I've always enjoyed learning about them. And again, my knowledge is very limited, so I won't try to give a complete overview of their history. But the Ottomans are originally a nomadic Turkic tribe that settles in Anatolia. And after a series of conquests and fights, the House of Osman, which becomes the basis of the ruling Ottoman dynasty, do establish themselves in Anatolia. They do take most of Greece and the Latin kingdoms until ultimately, with Mehmed II, he takes the great city of Constantinople in 1453, fully taking out the Byzantine Empire and slowly but surely incorporating the rest of Anatolia, Greece, and much of the North African countries. It's, again, very, very fascinating how fast they're able to expand. And then, of course, as Luke also mentioned, the ruler at this time who's pushing for, getting Malta, getting rid of the knights, was Suleiman the Magnificent, whom scholars agree in the history of Ottoman rulers is probably regarded as the most famous. So, Luke, I would just like to hear your thoughts on, the relationship and sort of like the existence of like the knights at this time, because from someone who, again, does not know very much about this time period, the knights tend to be, or at least are seen at this time, maybe they didn't think of that as themselves, but maybe others thought them, that they are like a relic from the past. They are literally people out of time. They are completely isolated in the Mediterranean Ocean. Yes, they do have some trade. They do have some connections because they were corsairs, are able to get information, but they are literally people out of time, so to speak, that they are like the last remnants of a history that's no longer present, at least at that time. Okay, yes, loud
Okay.
and clear.
All right. 1 second. Okay, I just need to change the sound so that you come into the. Okay, I'll just leave it like this. It's the microphone. Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Ah, okay, okay. They're coming through here now. Okay. So it depends what period you're talking about. So if I had to say the middle of the 17th century, then I wouldn't agree with you. The it was the height, I would say even more so than when they were in the Crusade states, the height of the order's power.
Mm.
There is a very, very good book by, I already mentioned him, Luke Gauci, called doesn't want to come out, Morte o Fortuna, which is basically a study on the corsairing enterprises of the Maltese Corso and the Order of St. John. And I would say that that is the height of their power. They
Mm.
were licensed, they were literally licensed privateers. They were the scourge of, they were essentially, they were the Royal Navy of the 16th and 17th century. When we imagine the height of naval power, we think of, 17th, 18th century, the Royal Navy in the Caribbean and so on and so on. But if you have to depict the corsairing activities of the Order of St. John in the 16th and the 17th century, this is how would describe it. Now, on the other hand, if you then describe the Order of St. John in 1798, on the eve of the French invasion of the islands, because what Napoleon wanted, he got, um, then I would somewhat agree with you. So after the French took the islands, then yes, I would agree that the Order of St. John was looked at as a relic of the past.
Mm.
It is a question of, it is more a question of they had to change their orientation. So when they were in the Holy Land, they focused on the hospital, as you said, and the military half of side alongside the Templars.
Mm.
Um, Once they end up on Rhodes and then eventually on Malta, they shift their dynamic to corsairing. So their power still existed, their wealth still existed. There is, and I have to ask Steve Tibble about this, but uh, when the Templars were wiped out, if I'm not mistaken, some of their property ended up in the hands of the Knights of the Order of St. John. Um, So it is depends on what period you're talking about. It is their dynamic changed.
Mm.
Okay, that is how I would describe it to a certain extent.
That is fair. That is a fair statement, and it is actually true because if you think of it, if you look at like the history of like the Knights of the Hospital, I mean, they do start off at like as a land-based military force like any other medieval army at this time, but being pushed to a different geography. It's different. It's completely unlike anything they were known at the time. You are absolutely right that they did have to adapt. They did have to change. They had to become corsairs to fight, to be the scourge, to be like the little, as you mentioned, the gnats of the Ottomans, just annoying the hell out of them, just doing
And
anything they could.
and to be fair, we didn't even mention the Battle of Lepanto, which was about 5 years after the Great Siege, in 1571, if I'm not mistaken, 70 or 71, one of them. Which was the Holy League. So we have the Order of St. John, some of the Maltese Corsairs, Venice, the Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire, and some of the Spanish holdings in Naples and Aragon fighting against the Ottomans again. It's the last major naval battle fought on galleys. There is a very good painting again in the collection of the Maritime
Ah,
Museum,
mm-hmm.
um, that it's digitized. You can see it if you go on the website, depicting the Battle of Lepanto. And that's just, I mean, in the Battle of Lepanto, strictly speaking, the Order of St. John only contributed 3 galleys. But the fact that a military order on an island could contribute even 3 galleys to such a major Christian alliance is significant. I would say that the major maritime powers of the 16th and the 17th century were the Order of St. John, Venice, and the Ottoman Empire.
Nice. Fascinating. Now, this is going to what you mentioned earlier in the discussion, Luke, how, the history that, or these stories that have been purported about the siege of Malta was that Suleiman the Magnificent wanted to use it as a staging ground to invade Sicily and the underbelly of Europe. But you actually added a counter to that in sense that, in theory, yes, Suleiman could have used Malta as a staging ground, but you also stated that he didn't necessarily needed Malta to launch his invasions if he wanted to. As you also said, there were numerous other islands that were closer. They could have invaded from there and just conquered Sicily, and then possibly, if they could, logistically speaking, invade the southern half of Italy and just moving way up to the Papal States. They could have probably, in theory, taken half of Italy if they wanted to. So, would you argue, from an historian's point of view, that the taking of Malta was more so a personal goal as opposed to a military objective?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So I personally think, based on the sources, that it is a mix of both. You have the desire to wipe out the Order of St. John once and for all, but you also have the desire to conquer Europe. I mean, we know that at roughly this time, the Ottomans were at the gates of Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
So technically, they had already invaded Europe. I mean, but even simply to invade Sicily or even Italy, they controlled Greece. They could have launched an invasion of Italy from the Lazio or even from the Peloponnese. So this idea that Malta is, without shadow of doubt, the gateway to Europe is not completely unfounded. Yes, it is one of the major stepping stones to Europe, and had the Knights lost the siege of 1565, then yes, I would agree, Malta would have played a role in the eventual conquest of Europe. But to invade Europe from the Ottoman perspective, you don't have to take Malta. So I think it is a mix of both.
Mm.
So they could have invaded Italy from the Peloponnese or from the Lazio. They could have invaded Italy from Tunisia. Technically, Tunisia is closer to Sicily than Malta is. Um, Plus, as you mentioned as well, there are numerous other islands around this area of the Mediterranean. So I think we need to, when viewing these events, need to take a step back and think, look, we have a history of a major event that occurred in Maltese history. We cannot think that we are the center of the world anymore. Malta was important. Strategically, it was always important. It would be important during the Arabic sieges. We know what's been done. Sicily was, and Malta was part of Dar al-Islam until the Norman conquests in the 11th century. So we know that um, an Islamic invasion from North Africa is possible.
Mm.
They didn't. They invaded Sicily first in the 870s. They didn't need Malta. They simply invaded Sicily and eventually took Malta in 870. So we have proof there, written there, that an invasion of Sicily can be done without taking Malta. Even if you look back into antiquity,
And it's true.
Carthage to invade
Mm-hmm.
during the Punic Wars, during the first Punic War, Malta wasn't involved. They the invasions of Sicily were undertaken from Carthaginian land in North Africa. The Romans took Malta in 218, but militarily, strategically, they didn't gain anything by taking Malta. It was just another stepping stone to North Africa, but they didn't need to take it, so to speak. It works
Hmm.
both ways. So we need to not diminish the importance of the siege of 1565 because it was a significant event. It always will be a significant event in Maltese history, in Mediterranean history, but we need to look at it from in perspective. So, from a military point of view, you don't necessarily need Malta to invade Sicily.
Right. Absolutely, very, very true. And also like to add about again, those like going to the main characters of this story. If you looked at which again, Luke, thank you for showing those models. Those actually were very, very helpful and also very cool. Is actually the second picture that you show for that the second model
The
and talk
yeah,
about the military, the armies that were fighting like the D-Day
oh
style.
yeah, so
And
this one.
yes, absolutely. Love that. Absolutely incredible. And for those who are unfamiliar with the term Janissary when talking about the Ottomans, now Janissaries were, and the language of this term has been changed numerous times over, but what can be agreed upon is that the Janissary Corps were originally slaves and children taken from conquered Christian lands, indoctrinated into the Ottoman military doctrine, raised at birth, trained as an elite guard of the Ottoman royal family, the royal court. They were the bodyguards. These were the elite troopers. You could, in theory, call them the Ottoman shock troopers, but that term can be used loosely depending on the other military forces that the Ottomans had. You have the standard Ottoman army, Janissary Corps, which became its own military unit, and others. But it is very fascinating to talk about them because, again, the Janissary Corps and their history with the Ottomans is fascinating. And you can even divulge a whole episode on their relationship with the Ottomans and what ultimately ends up happening to the Janissary Corps later in history. But as I said, that'll be a separate episode. But digressing, as Luke said, we cannot take away the importance of the sieges that occurred on the island of Malta. These were very, very significant, very, very impactful, and they did play a huge role in world history and really showcasing, just how violent and like dangerous late medieval battles still were. Yes, you did have the advent of gunpowder with the cannons, but this was still close quarter fighting. You would have, and I trying to remember the term, you would have early firearms, arquebuses around this time. Ottomans probably used them. Maybe there's evidence of the knights procuring them through their raids as corsairs, but this was still close quarter fighting in the medieval sense. And one thing, Luke, that I did want to ask you that you
Hmm.
also brought up too is sort of like the myths and history surrounding these battles of the island of Malta that they have been blown up into proportion, sometimes over proportion. In your research, when does that really come about, and why is it, depending on who you talk to, a disservice or exaggerate an over exaggeration of these significant battles?
So, I already mentioned one of my lecturers. He is even he is the foremost expert on the Order of Saint John, Malta. Victor Malia Melanes. Famously, we he used to say, well, still says it. Um, it was not a great siege. We had a joke at the university when we were when I was at university. They used to say, "Ah, the not so great siege of Malta." Um, it is, I think it is a sense, and I might be wrong on this, to be fair, but when Malta was emerging as a state, so in the 19th and the 20th century, I know we said we wouldn't venture into these centuries, but I broke my own promise. Um, um, we wanted to look more European. Famously, Malta has
Mm,
always been considered half and half African, half European. This is why the nobles that I mentioned before at Universitas were not always, well, they were never considered on the level of the nobility of Europe. So the idea of stopping such a massive Ottoman invasion, saving, in inverted commas, Europe from the Ottoman scourge, blew up the the importance of the Great Siege of Malta. Now, as we said, this is not to diminish the importance of the siege. The siege was a significant event, as we've mentioned multiple
mm,
times, and should be treated as such. But the need to appear more European, to be accepted as a European state that would eventually lead to self-governance and independence, made these type of events more significant. To give you another example, which will probably is a pretty good example and what people know me for, if we take the 1091 raid of Malta by Roger the Norman, um, traditional history says that, or at least this is how I heard it growing up, that 870 the islands are taken by the Arabs, again diminishing the identity of the Almoravid Caliphate, but anyway, and that the Maltese were subjected to rule by the Arabs, by
mm,
the Almoravids, and that in 1090 Count Roger liberated the islands, liberated the Maltese, the Christian Maltese, from the Arab rule, gave them famously their flag, which is total bollocks, but anyway. Um, and it was an idea to make Malta look more Christian, more European.
mm,
An attempt by the church to depict, look, we were never Islamic, despite the fact that we were for 250-ish years. There is some evidence of Christian continuation, but I won't get into that. But the idea was we need to look European, we need to look Christian, we want to be a nation, a European nation. So let's alter these events in history. Let's enlarge the siege of 1565 to make us look like we are the gateway to Europe. Even to contemporaries in the 16th and 17th century, the money kept coming in. The Order of St. John, it paid them in the long run to make the siege of 1565 this great thing, because that is how Europe viewed it. Then the money kept pouring in. So, as I said before, we have to give and take. It was a significant event, yes, but we cannot blow it out of proportion.
yes, absolutely. Very true. And I think you can also apply it to a lot of other important battles in history that have also gone away of like this mindset of trying to take an event in history and using it to either, what's the word I'm thinking of? To again blow it out of proportion. Again, not taking anything away from the significance, but again, just blowing it out of proportion and using it to like suit a certain agenda. And the last thing I did want to touch on before we officially end this incredible discussion on the Siege of Malta is ultimately, Luke, as a fellow historian academic, to the viewers out here watching this, ultimately, what do you want them to take away from this discussion and the Battle of Malta, the Siege of Malta, in its relation to the wider scope of not just European history, but military history, crusading history, and global history?
I think, as we've been mentioning, the importance of the significance of these events. That is what I feel is the biggest takeaway from the siege. So, yes, you have a siege that transformed Malta into the early modern fortress that it was. But the biggest takeaway that you can take is, aside from the significance of the event, the role that it played. It created a state that was significant. So, Hospitaller Malta was seen as a significant state. Then, later, when Malta is emerging as a sovereign state, it is again used to portray our Europeanness. Now, we can continue jumping the hurdles and say, look, Malta's European, it's always been European, but our language is Maltese is practically made up of the majority of it is Arabic. Complexion wise, okay, I'm my parents often say I look like a ghost, but the Maltese complexion is on the darker side. Even some of the place names that we have on the island are rooted in their Arabic name terminology. So we have to, the biggest takeaway from these types of events would be context. How do you put in the modern academic study, how do you put these events in the context without blowing them out of proportion? So it's a matter of give and take. Yes, acknowledge the importance, but acknowledge that importance within the greater context of the events that are occurring in the Mediterranean. Oh, as we mentioned, the Ottomans were at this stage already at the gates of Vienna. They were already in Europe. Whether or not they had taken Malta in the long run didn't really matter, in my opinion. They were in Europe. There were other areas that they could invade. This we cannot diminish the strategic importance of Malta, but we cannot shape our history around that sole aspect. We have to interpret it with different perspectives. And I think that is the biggest takeaway from the siege of 1565.
Absolutely, very true, Luke. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude this amazing discussion here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe for the Historians Lounge, Season 3, Episode 10. I want to give a huge thank you to my good friend Luke for coming back on the show and sharing with us this incredible history. And we wish him all the best for the rest of this year and going into 2026. Now, Luke, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out and connect? And do you have any upcoming projects that you would like to share?
So I have an Instagram. It's essentially it's Luke Gauci without the E, so it's LUK Gauci. I have an academia.tu page. If you Google my name, it will come up. I have a ResearchGate page, which I don't really use, but it's there as well. Hopefully, my biggest project at the moment is my master's. Hopefully, I'll manage to finish it eventually. Up until 10 minutes before this interview, that's what I was doing, writing chapter 3. All right, Mr. Dalli, I'm working on it. Okay. I have the paper that I mentioned that's coming out in the Heritage Malta Journal this year that will be available. Other than that, not much at the moment. I mean, come and visit us at the Hal Safrin Hypergeo. Buy your tickets in advance, please. Because if I have to say go to St. Elmo to buy the tickets another time, I'll probably explode. But anyway, um, if anyone would like to reach out, feel free to reach out. I'd just like to mention my colleagues. I already mentioned Ivan and Gianluca from the Maritime Museum. I mentioned my current colleagues, Anna and Kevin and Katya and Daniel and Jerome and John and Antea and Tanya and Manuel. Otherwise, that's it from me. Essentially.
Awesome. I will link all that down below in the description of this video. And if you'd like to see Luke's first time on the show and his first ever historians interview, I will also link it right here for you to watch and view. Again, thank you everyone for joining us for the 10th episode for season 3 of the Historians Lounge. Again, a huge thank you to my friend Luke for coming back on the show for his second appearance. And if you'd like to see him again with possibly a few other honorable mentions, other fellow medievalists that have been on the show for a very special debate on medieval history, comment down below and I will try to make that happen. Maybe that will be a special episode for 2026. Until next time, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date with the new episodes coming out this week and the weeks after for the month of October. And until next time, viewers and listeners, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Have a wonderful morning, and we'll see you all next time.